The glove was gone before I had finished my second cup of tea, and I knew without lifting my eyes from the correspondence that my wolf was the thief. "Fenric," I said, not unkindly, to the empty doorway of my study, "bring it back." No wolf answered, because no wolf ever answered when he had done something he intended to keep doing. Down in the garden, I heard Marisol's voice lift in surprised laughter, the sound carrying up through the open window like a bell struck once and left to ring. I told myself I was only listening for trouble. I had told myself that for the better part of a year now, every time her voice found its way to wherever I stood in Sablewick, and I had never once believed it. I set down my pen and went to the window. Below, in the kitchen garden that Marisol had made ordered and green out of what had been a tangle of bramble when she came to us, my wolf sat with great dignity among the rows of new lettuces. One gray glove clamped gently in his jaws. His tail, sweeping slow, arcs through the dirt like a courtier, well pleased with himself. Marisol stood over him with her hands on her hips, dark hair coming loose from its pins, and she was not truly angry. I could see that even from this height. She was fighting a smile the way she always fought smiles in my direction, as if amusement were a coin she could not afford to spend carelessly. "That is the second one this week, you dreadful animal," she said. "I shall have to write to the king about you." I straightened so fast, I nearly cracked my skull on the window frame. By the time I reached the garden path, unhurried on the outside and considerably less unhurried within, Fenric had not surrendered a single thread of the glove. He lay flat on his belly now, chin resting on his stolen prize, watching me approach with the particular smugness that only a wolf who has never once lost an argument can produce. "Give it to her," I said. Fenric's ears went back, not in fear. He had never in his life feared me, but in the manner of a creature settling in for a long negotiation he had already won. He glanced at Marisol, then at me. Then, with maddening precision, he rose, carried the glove 3 full steps toward her, and laid it down exactly halfway between us both, equidistant to the inch, before retreating to sit upon it like a hen upon an egg. Marisol laughed outright then, covering her mouth, and the sound did something to my chest that I had long since stopped trying to name or examine, because naming it would have required admitting things I was not yet prepared to admit, even to myself, even alone at night with no one to hear me fail to say them. "He wants us to fetch it together, your grace," she said. "He wants a great many things he shall not get," I said, and crouched to retrieve the glove myself, which was, I understood only after the fact, precisely the wrong move. Fenric's paw came down over the glove a half-second before my hand did, gentle but immovable as a closed gate, and he looked up at me with eyes the pale gold of a wolf who has decided he knows better than his king, and is prepared to prove it through simple persistence. I withdrew my hand. He did not withdraw his paw. "He is being ridiculous," I said. "He is being very determined," Marisol said, and crouched down on the other side of him, close enough now that I could smell the rosemary she had been trimming, close enough that when she reached out to scratch behind Fenric's ear, her sleeve nearly brushed my own. Fenric, the traitor, leaned bodily into her hand, and in doing so, allowed the glove to slip from beneath his paw directly into the narrow space between our 2 sets of knees. Neither of us moved to take it for a long moment. I do not know what held her still. I know precisely what held me. The simple, foolish wish that this moment, absurd as it was, might not end. "I believe," Marisol said at last, very carefully, not looking at me, "that your wolf has opinions about how the household ought to be arranged." "My wolf," I said, "has no authority in this household." Fenric made a sound in his throat that was unmistakably a scoff, and took the glove again. He had been my companion since he was a pup no larger than a loaf of bread, found half-starved on the eastern border in the last hard winter of my father's reign, and he had grown into something more than a hound and less than a second self, a creature who read my moods before I knew them, who had, on more than one occasion, planted himself between me and a threat before I had finished perceiving it as one. He had never before, in all our years together, involved himself in matters of my heart. I had not known there was a precedent for it. I was beginning to suspect there would be no shortage of precedent from this day forward. He had, in his younger years, shown a similar single-mindedness only once before, when a wandering sickness took hold of the western flocks, and he refused for the better part of a week to leave the sheepfold, sleeping among the ailing ewes and driving off every crow that came near until the worst of the illness passed. I had thought that devotion remarkable at the time, a loyalty to creatures under my protection that ran deeper than mere training. I understood only now, watching him orchestrate his campaign of stolen gloves with the same fixed, unshakable purpose, that Fenric had never in his life done anything by half measure, and that I ought to have expected, the moment he set his mind to matchmaking, that he would see the matter through with the same relentless thoroughness he brought to guarding sick ewes from crows. Marisol had come to Sablewick 11 months before, sent by her aunt's household to oversee my correspondence when my previous secretary retired to his daughter's farm, and had within a season made herself indispensable in ways that had nothing to do with letters. She had reordered my gardens from memory of some finer estate in her girlhood. She had taught the youngest kitchen girl her letters without being asked. She had a way of standing very straight when she disagreed with me on some point of household economy, chin lifted, voice even, that I found more compelling than I would ever have admitted aloud. I had watched her for the better part of a year and said nothing that mattered, because I was a king who had buried a father, a mother, and 2 elder brothers before I was 30, and had learned early that the things a man wants most are the things fate is likeliest to take from him if he says their names too loudly. I remembered the morning she arrived with a clarity that unsettled me even now. A slight woman in a gray traveling cloak standing in the courtyard with a single trunk, and a letter of introduction held very correctly in both hands, looking up at the gray stone of Sablewick as though she meant to measure herself against it, and would not be found wanting. Fenric, who had regarded every new servant in the household with polite indifference for the whole of his life, had risen from his place at the foot of the steps and walked directly to her, and pressed his head against her skirts as if he had been waiting for her arrival specifically, and had simply not known which day to expect it. I had thought nothing of it then. I had thought a great many things nothing of, in those first months, that I understood later to have been the truth arriving early, and being turned away at the door out of sheer stubborn caution. She had not asked for an easy place among us, and she had not been given one. My household was old and set in its ways, and a woman who altered the order of things without waiting for permission was, at first, regarded with the particular suspicion the settled reserve for the capable. But she had won them over one small kindness at a time, the way frost yields to a patient sun, and within half a year there was no one in Sablewick, from Brennan down to the youngest boy who mucked out the stables, who did not light up somewhat at the sound of her step in the corridor. I had lit up more than any of them and hidden it best of all, or so I had believed, until my wolf made it his personal business to inform the entire household otherwise. So I had said nothing, and apparently my wolf had grown tired of waiting for me to find my courage. The glove theft continued for the better part of a fortnight, and in that time I learned a great deal about my own wolf that 11 years of companionship had somehow failed to teach me. I had always believed Fenric a creature of simple loyalties: food, the hunt, the borders of our territory, and myself, in roughly that order of enthusiasm. I had not known he possessed anything resembling patience, still less strategy, until I watched him apply both to the single-minded project of throwing his king into the company of one particular woman at every possible opportunity. He began to take note, I came to realize, of our separate schedules with an attentiveness that would have shamed half my border scouts. He knew that I took my morning correspondence in the study that overlooked the kitchen garden. He knew that Marisol favored the hour just after dawn for her weeding, before the heat of the day and the household's demands claimed her. He had, it seemed, matched these two facts together with the precision of a man laying siege lines, and had simply begun to arrange small accidents of timing until the accident ceased to be accidental at all. He took her gloves from the garden wall where she set them to dry. He took a ribbon from her hair once, which she did not notice missing until she found it, days later, woven with peculiar care into his own collar, as if he wished her to know precisely whose doing it had been. He took, on one memorable afternoon, an entire basket of mending, and distributed its contents with great ceremony across the length of the courtyard, so that the only way to gather it back up required Marisol and myself to work from opposite ends toward the middle, meeting somewhere near a rose trellis with our arms full of half-finished linen, and our faces far too close for either of us to pretend the nearness was accidental. There was, too, the matter of the market morning, which I have since come to regard as the moment Fenrick's ambitions grew from mischief into something closer to strategy. I had gone down to the lower courtyard to see the wool merchants settled before the gates opened to the town, a task that required no particular attention from Marisol at all, and yet there she was among the stalls, sent, she told me, to price new linen for the household accounts. I did not believe for one moment that Brennan had sent her without design. I believed it even less when Fenrick appeared at my heel from nowhere in particular, trotted directly to her side, and proceeded to herd her. There is no gentler word for it, though herding a woman of her composure was no small feat, through the press of the crowd toward where I stood arguing the price of undyed wool, until she arrived at my elbow breathless and laughing, and entirely unable to explain how she had gotten there. "Your wolf," she said, "does not believe in half measures." "My wolf," I said, watching Fenrick sit at her feet with the serene expression of a job well done, "has apparently decided that half measures are beneath the dignity of this house." We priced the linen together after that, because there seemed little point in pretending we had not been thrown into each other's company by 4 determined paws, and I found I did not mind the pretending failing as much as I ought to have minded it. The wool merchant, an old man who had sold cloth to my father before me, watched the two of us over his scales with an expression of profound and unhidden satisfaction, and charged us, I noticed only later, considerably less than his usual rate. There was, besides, the afternoon of the ruined council seal, which I have never fully forgiven Fenrick for and never fully wished undone either. I had been sealing a treaty renewal with the Southern Holdings, a tedious document requiring 3 separate wax impressions and a witness's signature, when Fenrick trotted into my study uninvited, deposited one of Marisol's gardening aprons directly across my desk, and sat upon the unsigned treaty with the placid immovability of a boulder that had decided to grow legs. I ordered him off. He declined to move. I attempted to lift him bodily, which one does not easily do with a wolf who outweighs most grown men and has no intention of cooperating, and in the resulting struggle I upset an entire pot of red sealing wax across the treaty, the apron, and a fair portion of my own sleeve. Marisol arrived not 2 minutes later, drawn, she claimed, by the apron's sudden absence from the drying line, and found her king standing amid a ruin of spilled wax with a wolf sitting in smug possession of a ruined treaty, and laughed so hard she had to sit down on the very bench by the door, both hands pressed to her mouth, while I attempted with diminishing dignity to explain that this was, in fact, an important matter of state. "He has cost you a treaty," she said, when she had recovered enough breath to speak. "He has cost me a treaty," I agreed, "and an apron, and what remains of my patience, and I begin to suspect he considers all 3 a fair price for the pleasure of your company in my study for the length of an afternoon." "You might simply invite me," she said, still laughing, "and spare the treaties." It was as close as either of us had yet come to saying the thing plainly, and I felt the nearness of it the way one feels a held breath. And then the moment passed, as such moments had a habit of passing between us in those weeks, because I reached for the ruined treaty instead of for her, and told myself there would be a better hour for courage than one that smelled of scorched wax. I sent word to the Southern Holdings that the treaty would be delayed a week for a matter of household accident, which was true enough as far as it went, though I did not trouble to explain the precise nature of the accident to their envoy, a solemn man who would not have known what to make of a king undone by his own wolf. Brennan, when I told him the tale that evening, laughed so hard he had to set down his cup, and observed that Fenrick's grasp of diplomacy exceeded my own, since a delayed treaty cost the kingdom rather less than 11 months of unspoken feeling had already cost my own peace of mind. "He will have his reward for it, I suppose," I said, somewhat sourly. "He has already had it," Brennan said. "You cannot buy a wolf's loyalty with roast mutton. Once he has decided, he would rather be paid in your happiness." I had no answer for that, and so I said nothing, and went instead to inspect the damage to my study, where Fenrick lay curled with great contentment upon the very rug the wax had missed, entirely unrepentant, as if he had calculated the whole affair down to the last drop. The household began to notice. "Fenrick has taste," said old Brennan, my seneschal, one morning, watching the wolf trot past with one of Marisol's shawls trailing from his jaws like a banner. "More sense than some men I could name, your grace, if your grace will permit the observation." "Your grace will not permit it," I said, and Brennan, who had known me since I was in short breeches and had never once been intimidated by my crown, only smiled into his own beard and said nothing further, which was somehow worse. The kitchen girls took to watching from the scullery window whenever Fenrick began one of his campaigns, wagering small coins on how long it would take him to maneuver Marisol and me into proximity. I learned of this only because I overheard two of them settling a debt in the corridor outside my study, and when I demanded to know what had prompted the exchange of coin, they fled so fast one of them lost a slipper, which Fenrick found within the hour and added, with evident pride, to what I had begun privately to think of as his collection. Even the stable master, a taciturn man named Godwin who had not to my knowledge volunteered an opinion on any matter outside the condition of my horses in a decade of service, found occasion to remark upon the situation. I came upon him one afternoon watching Fenrick trot past with a second stolen ribbon, and he said, without any preamble whatsoever, "That wolf has more courage than his king, if your grace will forgive the plain speaking," and then returned to currying my gray mare as though he had said nothing at all remarkable, leaving me to stand in the stable yard with no ready reply and considerable heat in my face. My own counsel, when the matter came up, as it inevitably did, during a recess in a tedious afternoon of grain tallies, proved no more restrained than the stable master. Old Lord Aldwin, who had served my father before me and took a grandfather's liberties with my patience, set down his papers and said, "Sire, I have negotiated 3 border treaties and 1 succession dispute in your service, and I confess none of them taxed my nerves so thoroughly as watching you fail, week upon week, to say 4 plain words to a woman who plainly wishes to hear them." "The matter is not before this council," I said, with as much dignity as I could summon. "No," Aldwin agreed placidly, "it is before your wolf, who appears to be managing it a good deal more competently than the council would," and the resulting laughter from the assembled lords was loud enough that I abandoned the grain tallies for the day rather than sit through another moment of it. I told myself, walking back to my study with as much wounded pride as a king may reasonably carry, that I would not be hurried into anything by the opinions of stable masters and counselors and wagering kitchen girls, whatever the state of my own heart. I told myself this with great conviction. It did not, in the end, count for very much against a wolf who had made up his mind. I ought to have put a stop to it. A king who cannot govern one wolf is a poor advertisement for a man who governs a kingdom. but every evening when I told myself I would speak sternly to the animal and mean it, I would find some excuse to walk the garden path instead, and there Marisol would be, kneeling among her herbs in the last gold light, and Fenric would look up at me with those pale eyes as if to say, "Well, are you going to do something useful with yourself? Or shall I go on doing it for you?" And I would find I had no stern words left in me at all. There was an evening, some days into the second week, when I very nearly said something true. We had ended up walking the same stretch of the garden wall at dusk, ostensibly because I was inspecting the state of the eastern hedge, and she was ostensibly gathering the last of the season's lavender, though neither task required the hour we spent at it, nor the slowness with which we walked, nor the silences that stretched between us comfortable as old friendship, and taut as something neither of us dared name. Fenric trotted just ahead of us the whole way, glancing back every few strides to be certain we had not fallen behind or, worse, turned back toward the house separately. "You are quiet tonight, Your Grace," Marisol said, when we had reached the low stone bench beneath the old apple tree, the one she had cleared of ivy herself in her first month at Sablewick. "I am considering how to say something," I admitted, before I had quite decided to admit it, and finding that I have no good way to begin it. She went very still beside me, the lavender forgotten in the crook of her arm. "You could simply begin," she said, "and trust the rest to follow." I opened my mouth. I believe had Fenric given me even 10 more seconds, I might have found the words that evening instead of a fortnight later. But at that precise moment, a fox screamed somewhere beyond the hedge, sharp and sudden in the falling dark, and my wolf was gone from my side in a bound, crashing off through the undergrowth in pursuit of some ancient grievance between wolves and foxes that I have never fully understood. And by the time he returned, tail high and thoroughly unrepentant, mudded to the shoulder. The moment had scattered like startled birds, and would not be called back that night. "Another time, perhaps," Marisol said, gathering her lavender and rising, and there was no reproach in it, only a gentleness that made the failure sting worse than any scolding could have. "Another time," I agreed, and told myself firmly that there would be one, and did not entirely believe myself even as I said it. Fenric, trotting between us back to the house, looked up at me once with an expression I could only interpret as deep and personal disappointment in my nerve, and I found I could not entirely disagree with his assessment. I did not sleep well that night, turning the lost moment over as a man turns a coin he has dropped and cannot find in the dark, certain of its shape, but unable to close his hand upon it. I told myself, somewhere near dawn, that I would not wait for another accident of moonlight and lavender to hand me my courage a second time, that I owed it to Marisol, and to whatever patience she had shown me these 11 months, to find the words on purpose rather than trust to chance and a wolf's meddling to produce them again. It was, I believed, a fine and resolute decision, arrived at with all the clarity of a sleepless mind at 4 in the morning. I did not, in the end, act upon it for the better part of another week, which taught me something further about the difference between resolving to be brave and actually managing it. The turn came on an ordinary evening, which is, I have come to believe, how the largest turns most often arrive, not with thunder, but with a wolf lying down in exactly the wrong place at exactly the right moment. We had gathered in the small hall after supper, as had become a quiet habit, Marisol with her mending, myself with reports from the northern boundary that I was reading rather than attending to, Brennan dozing by the fire in the manner of a man who dozes with one eye open. Fenric had been unusually still all evening, watching us both from his place on the hearth rug with an air of patient calculation, like a general surveying ground before battle. Then, without preamble, he rose, crossed the room, and lay down directly between my chair and Marisol's, so precisely in the center of the space that neither of us could shift our seats an inch closer without stepping over him, nor an inch farther without abandoning the fire. "Fenric," I said. He did not move. He put his chin on his paws and closed his eyes, the very picture of an animal settled for the night and not to be disturbed by kings. He does this now, Marisol said, not quite hiding her smile behind her needlework. Lies between us. I have noticed it 3 times this week alone. He is being deliberately provoking. Perhaps, she said, and there was something new in her voice, some thread of courage she had not shown me before. Perhaps he has simply noticed what the rest of the household noticed some time ago, Your Grace, and has grown impatient waiting for the 2 people most concerned to notice it themselves. Brennan, by the fire, made a sound that might have been a cough, and might have been a laugh very poorly disguised as a cough. I set down the Northern reports, because I found I could not read another word of them with my heart behaving as it was. And what, I said carefully, would the household have noticed? Marisol's needle stilled. For the first time since I had known her, she looked less than perfectly composed, a flush rising along her throat that she could not command away by will alone, however much I suspected she was trying. I would not presume to say, Your Grace. I am asking you to presume. Fenric, between us, thumped his tail once against the hearth rug, a single approving beat, as if he had been waiting 11 months for precisely this exchange, and would not now permit either of us to retreat from it. I looked at her, truly looked, the way I had not let myself look in all the months of careful, cowardly distance, at the lamplight on her dark hair, the steadiness that had never once wavered even when I was short-tempered with grief or worry, the quiet dignity with which she had built herself a place in my house without once asking for anything in return. And I understood, with the sudden clarity of a man setting down a weight he had carried so long he had forgotten it was a weight at all, that I did not want to spend one more evening pretending I did not know my own heart. I have watched you a very great while, Marisol, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended, stripped of every kingly polish I had ever learned. I have told myself it was only proper regard for a woman who serves my house well. I have told myself a great many things these 11 months, and my wolf, it seems, has believed none of them for a single day. Her needlework had gone entirely still in her lap. Brennan, wisely, had stopped even pretending to doze. I do not know how to say this the way it deserves to be said, I went on, because having begun I found I could not stop, the words coming loose like stones from a wall that had held back a river far too long. I only know that when Fenric brings me your glove, some fool part of me is glad of the excuse to carry it to you myself. I know that I have walked past this hall 100 times this month alone, inventing reasons, when the true reason was only ever that I wished to see your face. I know that my wolf worked this out before I permitted myself to, and I am, apparently, the last man in Sablewick to understand what every scullery girl in this house has wagered coin upon for a fortnight. Your Grace. Lucan, I said, if you would. Something crossed her face then that I had never seen there before, not the careful composure she wore like armor, but something unguarded and bright and almost disbelieving, as though she had waited so long to hear this that she had stopped letting herself hope for it. Lucan, she said, testing the shape of it, and the sound of my own name in her voice struck through me like nothing I had ever felt before, not heat, not the wolf instincts the old stories describe, but something far stranger and gentler, a kind of quiet unlocking, as if some door I had not known was shut in me swung open all at once and let in ordinary daylight. I had heard other men of my bloodline describe the bond in grander terms, fire and thunder and the turning of the world, and I had always privately thought them given to exaggeration. But this was not grand. This was only that the room seemed, for the first time in longer than I could say, entirely right, every lamp, every shadow, every small ordinary thing in it settling into a rightness I had not known was missing until it arrived. I have watched you too, she admitted, and her hands were not quite steady where they rested on the forgotten mending. I told myself it was not my place to say so. You are a king, and I am a woman who orders your letters and your lettuces, and I did not think. I think, I said, that we have both been considerably more foolish than one wolf. At my feet, Fenric let out a long, satisfied breath through his nose, the sigh of a creature whose long campaign has finally concluded in victory, and rolled deliberately onto his back, exposing his belly to the fire in an attitude of complete and unbothered triumph, as if to say that his work here was, at long last, done and he intended to nap through whatever came next. Brennan rose from his chair with the particular briskness of a man who has suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. I believe, he said, I am needed in the kitchens, though it was well past the hour any business could plausibly be conducted there, and he left us with a look on his face I could only describe as thoroughly pleased with himself, as if he too had been wagering coin on this outcome and meant to go collect his winnings before the scullery girls could dispute the terms. Marisol laughed, unsteady and bright, and reached down to scratch Fenric's exposed belly without quite seeming to notice she had done it, her eyes still fixed on mine. Your wolf is going to be unbearable now, she said. He will think himself responsible for everything that ever happens in this house. He will be entirely correct to think so, I said, and found I was smiling in a way that felt unfamiliar on my own face, some old caution finally loosening its grip after 11 months of careful, guarded watching. Though I intend to claim at least partial credit for having finally said the words myself, however long he had to lie between our chairs to make me do it. A full fortnight of stolen gloves, she said. I counted. 4 gloves, I said, 1 ribbon, a shawl, an entire basket of mending. And I am reliably informed, 1 slipper belonging to a kitchen girl who has not yet forgiven him. He is a menace. He is, I agreed, the most competent matchmaker in the kingdom, and I shall have to raise his supper rations for the rest of his life as thanks, though I will deny under oath to my counsel that I ever said so. She was still laughing softly when I reached across the small space between our chairs past the wolf, who did not so much as open an eye, having apparently decided his part in the evening's proceedings was thoroughly finished, and took her hand in mine for the first time. It was not a grand gesture. It was only a hand, work-roughened from the garden, fitting into my own as though it had always meant to, and I understood then that this quiet unlocking I felt, this sense of a house finally settled and lamplit and right, was not going to announce itself with thunder after all. It had simply been waiting, patient as a wolf on a hearth rug, for both of us to stop being too careful to claim it. Outside, the last of the evening light was fading gold over the garden she had made, and somewhere in the kitchens I could hear, faintly, the unmistakable sound of coins changing hands. Word of it spread through Sablewick faster than any royal proclamation I had ever issued, which was, I reflected later, a fitting irony, since I had spent 11 months attempting to keep the matter entirely private, and had been undone in the space of a single evening by a wolf with no interest in discretion whatsoever. By the following morning, the kitchen girls who had wagered on the outcome were settling their debts openly in the great hall, without even the pretense of shame, and Brennan had, by some means I never fully untangled, informed the stable master, who informed the gate wardens, who informed the wool merchant at the next market day, so that when Marisol and I walked down together to inspect a shipment of dyed cloth, the old man bowed to her with a courtly flourish quite unlike his usual brisk manner and called her, to her evident mortification and my considerable delight, "Your future grace." "They are all impossible," she said to me afterward, though she was smiling in a way she no longer troubled to hide. "Every last one of them." "They have waited 11 months for this," I said. "I believe some latitude is owed them." "You waited 11 months for this," she pointed out. "I begin to suspect I might have waited a 12th and a 13th had Fenric not taken matters into his own paws." I could not honestly dispute it, and so I did not try. Instead, I told her, as we walked back up through the lower town with the wolf ranging ahead of us in wide, contented loops, of the evening by the apple tree when the fox had ruined my nerve. And she laughed until she had to stop walking altogether, one hand braced against the old stone wall, and declared that she had wondered for a full week afterward what I had meant to say, and had very nearly asked Brennan outright whether he knew. "He would have told you everything," I said. "He has no loyalty left to me on this particular subject. I believe he transferred it entirely to Fenric some weeks ago." "A wise transfer," she said. "Fenric has been the more reliable of the two of you." I could not argue that point either. In the days that followed our evening in the small hall, I found that the strange, quiet unlocking I had felt when she first said my name did not fade as I had half expected feeling to fade, the way the flush of a fine morning gives way by noon to ordinary daylight. It remained, steady as a hearth kept banked through the night, so that even in the driest hour of council business, some part of me stood always faintly turned toward wherever in Sablewick she happened to be, the way a compass needle stands turned toward north whether or not the traveler carrying it troubles to look down. I did not need to look down. I simply knew, the way I knew my own hands, whether she was in the east garden or the linen room or standing just beyond my study door working up the courage to knock, and each time the knowledge arrived it brought with it that same settling, that same sense of a room correctly furnished at last. She told me, one evening not long after, that she felt something of the same, though she described it in her own words, gentler and more exact than mine. "It is as though a lamp I did not know was unlit in me has been given its flame," she said, "and now I cannot walk past a single dark room in this house without wanting to carry it in." I thought that a finer description than anything I could have offered, and told her so, and she laughed and said a woman who had spent a year ordering another man's correspondence had better learn to turn a phrase or two in her own defense. We did not rush what followed, though the household, in its enthusiasm, would gladly have hurried us to the altar within the fortnight. There was, in truth, a certain pleasure in taking our time that neither of us wished to surrender to the household's impatience. Long mornings spent walking the boundary of the estate together under no pretense at all. Evenings when she read to me from whatever book had caught her interest that week, while I pretended to attend to reports I had long since stopped following, quiet hours in which we simply learned each other properly, without a wolf's interference or 11 months of caution standing between us. Fenric, for his part, seemed to regard this settled contentment as sufficient reward for his labors, and largely retired from active meddling, though he never once failed to place himself squarely between our two chairs of an evening, a small, smug reminder of the campaign he had waged and won. I asked her, some weeks later in the same garden where Fenric had first stolen her glove, whether she would consent to be my wife and my queen, and I asked it plainly, without the ornament a king is supposed to bring to such moments, because I had learned by then that the plainest words were the ones that had always served us best. She said yes before I had entirely finished asking, which she claimed afterward was only fair, given how long I had made her wait for the question. And Fenric, who had been lying in wait behind the very same trellis where the mending basket had once scattered us together, chose that instant to come trotting out with something small and gray clamped triumphantly in his jaws. It was, of course, the very first glove he had ever stolen from her, retrieved from its long retirement by the hearth for what he had apparently judged to be the occasion of a lifetime, and he laid it at our joined feet with the solemn ceremony of a herald announcing a royal decree, then sat back on his haunches to observe the effect, tail sweeping the garden path in broad, satisfied strokes. "He has kept it all this time," Marisol said, crouching to retrieve it at last, turning the worn gray wool over in her hands with an expression I could not entirely name. Equal parts wonder and the particular tenderness one reserves for the truly ridiculous things that turn out in the end to have mattered more than anything sensible. "He has kept a great many things," I said, "that the rest of us were too slow to claim for ourselves." She looked up at me then, glove in hand, sunlight caught in her dark hair the way it had been that very first morning I had watched her from my study window without admitting to myself why I watched. And I thought that if any household in the whole of the wolf kingdoms had ever been so thoroughly and unrepentantly matched by an animal too impatient for his king's caution, I had certainly never heard tell of it, and did not, in truth, much wish to hear of any other. The wedding, when it came, was a smaller affair than the council would have preferred, and a larger one than either Marisol or I had originally intended, since half of Sablewick considered itself to have played some essential part in the courtship, and none of them could be persuaded to stay quietly at home. Brennan gave a toast so long and so thoroughly embroidered with the tale of stolen gloves, and scattered mending that I was obliged, twice, to remind him gently that there existed other subjects in the world worth a household's attention. The kitchen girls, grown bold with their winnings, presented Marisol with a small embroidered pouch in which, they informed her with great ceremony, she might now safely keep her gloves out of further reach of thieving wolves, a gift Fenric regarded from across the courtyard with an expression of such open betrayal that even the stable master laughed. He did not in the end forgive the pouch, nor entirely abandon his old habits. He stole one more glove that autumn, from the pair Marisol wore to walk the frost-touched garden paths as my wife rather than my secretary, and when I went to retrieve it on her behalf, out of long habit more than real complaint, he looked up at me with the same pale, patient eyes he had worn on that very first morning, as if to remind me that some campaigns, once won, are simply kept in reserve against the day a king might need reminding of how he came to be so fortunate. I let him keep that one too. Brennan, for his part, never tired of retelling the tale to any visiting dignitary who could be persuaded to sit still for it, embellishing some new detail with each telling, until the treaty had become 3 treaties, and the fox had become, in one particularly enthusiastic version, an entire pack of raiding foxes driven off single-pawed by my wolf's valor. Marisol bore these embellishments with far more patience than I managed, and would only catch my eye across whatever hall we happened to be standing in that moment, the two of us sharing the private amusement of 2 people who alone knew the plainer, smaller truth of how it had actually happened. A fortnight of stolen gloves, 1 scattered basket of mending, a ruined treaty, and a wolf too impatient to wait any longer for his king to find his own courage. I came to think, in the years that followed, that this was perhaps the truest gift Fenric had given us, beyond even the forcing of the words themselves. Not merely that he had brought us together, but that he had made the manner of it so thoroughly ridiculous that neither of us could ever stand on ceremony about it afterward. A courtship built on stolen gloves and startled foxes leaves little room for the kind of careful distance that had kept me silent for 11 months in the first place. We had been undone by comedy before we could be undone by caution, and I have never once regretted the order in which it happened. He kept the first glove he had ever stolen. I found it, months later, tucked into the corner of his favorite sleeping place by the hearth, worn soft with age and handling, and when I made to retrieve it for mending, he set one paw over it and looked at me with such wounded dignity that I left it exactly where it was. Some things I had learned, a king does well to leave to the wisdom of his wolf,